Here we go. Hi, everybody. First guest of the new year today, Darrin McMahon. First, I'd like to say hello. Then I'd like to read your biography. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so you are the Mary Brinsmead Wheelock Professor of History at Dartmouth College. I was a visiting professor at Dartmouth College back in 2002. We can talk about our respective experiences in Hanover, New Hampshire after. You are the author of several books and editor of several books, co-editor. Let me just read them for our folks. So here we've got Enemies of the Enlightenment, The French Counter-Enlightenment and the Making of Modernity, 2001. The one that made me aware of who you are, the one that I'm reading right here, this guy, Happiness, a History, awarded the Best Book of the Year honors by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Library Journal, and Slate Magazine. Wow. Then Divine Fury, a History of Genius. Some interesting things that we could talk about that one. And then several co-edited books, The Enlightenment, Critical Concepts in Historical Studies, Rethinking Modern European Intellectual History, and Genealogies of Genius. Did I cover pretty much everything, Darrin?
Pretty much, absolutely.
All
Yeah,
right.
thank you.
Okay, so then let me just mention to people how we connected. You are a historian by profession. I'm working right now on my latest book, which I need to submit by the end of March. So the clock is ticking with my publisher, although they're very nice about never reminding me of the clock. The book is about the recipe or a recipe for the good life. And so I'm immersing myself in all sorts of treatises on happiness and contentment and well-being and so on. And the book is partly, my personal journey through happiness, if you'd like, but also backed by science. And then I came across your book, Happiness, a History, where a historian is kind of tracing the concept of history throughout time. And I thought, oh, I need to speak to this guy. So I thought maybe we could start, Darrin, with just you giving us, as briefly as you can, a sort of summary of that historical trajectory of happiness.
A summary of the historical trajectory of happiness. Yeah, as briefly as I can. Okay, well, um, look, I got interested in the subject of happiness in part out of teaching at Columbia as a postdoc. They have a great books program they call Contemporary Civilization. It's a kind of core of readings. That begin in the ancient world and go to the present. And it struck me as I was teaching this course and reading these books that I'd claimed to have read for many years but never actually had, that that happiness is the central notion in the Western intellectual tradition, and it turns out really in all major intellectual traditions. And so the idea was to sort of trace changing conceptions from their emergence in Western discussion, the time of the Greeks, to the present. And so I begin with people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who pose this really central question, which becomes the question for classical philosophy, and that is, how do you attain the good life? How do you attain happiness through conscious action? And just that very move in its own right is an interesting one. I like to point out that the word for happiness in every Indo-European language is cognate with luck. So hap is an Old Norse and an Old English word. It means fortune. We still use it in words like happenstance or perhaps. But the idea embedded in this term and in so many others is that happiness is not something that you can control for yourself. That happiness is dictated by the gods or by fate or by fortune, by luck. And you have it or you don't, or if you have it now, it may be taken away really quickly. But there's not a whole lot you can do in terms of how you live your life in order to bring it about. And I think that's really a received idea for so many cultures, in which a notion of human agency, takes time to develop. Right, that for so many people, life is happens to them. They don't make their own fortune or own fate for themselves. So when somebody like Socrates says, all of us want to be happy, how can we bring that about? It's a kind of crucial shift, and it's indicative of a broader shift that's going on not just in Greece, but in many of the major religious traditions around the world that sometimes are singled out as occurring during the axial age, the sort of roughly the first millennium before the Common Era, when in religious tradition after religious tradition, something like that question gets posed, right? The Buddha does the same thing, right? Life is suffering, but how can we change our circumstances in order to bring about a kind of happiness or contentment? So I begin in there, and then in the Western tradition, I look at how those classical notions get received and Christianized. And again, there are analogies in other religious traditions, but in the Christian tradition, essentially what happens is that happiness gets displaced from this life to the next. So Saint Augustine, the great father of the church, says, that perfect happiness is not of this life because of original sin. We are in the world. We're constantly striving, constantly searching for something. And that very inability to satisfy ourselves is resonant of sin for Augustine, and an indication that we're not complete, we're not whole, and we won't be made complete or whole until we have God's grace and know God's bounty in the next life. So on some level, in this Christian conception, happiness is death, right? Or happiness is the everlasting life of death. So we could complicate that in many ways. There are different kind of Christian conceptions, but on roughly speaking, this is the idea that holds until the Age of Enlightenment, the long 18th century. Which I see as this crucial revolution in human expectations when considerable numbers of people, for the first time in human history, are presented with the novel idea that happiness is not just a great attainment through, supreme virtue, as it was for the Greeks or for many of the religious traditions, that happiness was not just, a product of luck or the bounty of the gods or for God's chosen, but happiness was something that we ought to have in the world by virtue of being human beings. That happiness was something that was really our kind of natural due. And that proclamation gets disseminated in the 18th century, and you see for the first time people talking about a right to happiness, right? Not just a right to pursue happiness, but a right to happiness, and you see this in documents in the 18th century, and gradually that spreads, and I'm summarizing a much more complex story, but one of the themes that I drive in the book is the way in which that 18th century assertion has really become kind of part and parcel of the world that we live in today, where I think we tend to think of happiness as something that we should have. Happiness is something that we're supposed to have, and when we're not happy, we ask what's wrong, either with the world or with ourselves. But it's become a kind of assumption in a way that it just wasn't for earlier cultures.
But I think you've done a nice job in summarizing some of the trajectory of happiness. But I guess a couple of questions. So in your description, you're basically arguing that where we ascribe, or rather, do we ascribe happiness as something that is fatalistic? Therefore, there's nothing that I can do. There's no attribution. There's no causal agent in me that can allow me to be happy or not. It's written in the sky, versus other conceptions that say, no, here are steps A, B, C, D by which I can become happy. And so I guess beyond that debate, the next debate would be, if I concede the point that part of happiness stems from my personal actions in the world as I live it, then we can still disagree on how I achieve happiness, right? So even within the Greeks, there are many different trajectories by which, once I concede that it's not only up to the gods and to the sky to decide if I'm going to be happy or not, we can still disagree in a myriad of ways as to how we get there. Are you able to maybe give us a brief overview? Let's go with the ancient Greeks, because I really immersed
Sure.
Yeah, so what are some, so we got the Stoics and so on. What are some of the big differences across all those schools?
Yeah, the philosophical schools of the ancient world are in many ways a kind of competition for acolytes, right? And each sage, master, philosopher presenting a different route to happiness, right? All claiming to have the answers. Medicine for the soul. And this is one of common metaphors that the Greeks use as, a philosopher as somebody who helps to cure us from our ills, our human ills. Right. And so the gamut is really wide. On one end of the extreme, you can look at the Epicurean tradition. Epicurus believed that human beings were, well, first of all, we were completely material. There was no immaterial soul. He believed that there were gods, but they didn't intervene in the world, and that happiness for him was essentially pleasure-pain calculus. Pleasure was good, and we should cultivate it as best we can. Now, people who read Epicurus know that that wasn't just a license for total hedonism. Epicurus was actually an ascetic philosopher, and he understood that many pleasures bring greater pains, and so he advocated a kind of a really close balance between pleasure and pain, and tried to cultivate the ability to take pleasure in very simple things. You don't need a lavish meal to make you happy. You should learn to take pleasure in a glass of water and a piece of bread. And if you can do that in life, if you can learn to take pleasure in simple things, well, then there'll be pleasures everywhere. So that's one conception of happiness. Another one that I think is still important today is Aristotle's. Aristotle's notion that happiness is a life lived in accordance with virtue. Virtue for Aristotle is a mean between extremes, and we should try to cultivate that mean in many different facets of our life. And Aristotle lays out a whole program of good living that involves the cultivation of our minds, but also of our bodies. That to some extent, assumes basic kind of material comforts, but then in addition to that, puts an emphasis on other virtues of character, which I think is particularly compelling. And although Aristotle recognizes that happiness should have a component of feeling like the Epicureans, he doesn't see happiness purely as pleasure-pain calculus. In fact, he understands that the happy man will often undergo a good deal of pain and a good deal of adversity, and we don't want to take that to the extreme, but we need to assume it in a life well lived. Between that gamut, then you get all sorts of different philosophical traditions, as you well know, the Stoic tradition, the Platonic tradition. But one of the things that unites these groups, and I think makes them different from us today, is that even Epicurus, who thinks of happiness in many ways as a kind of sensation of pleasure, conceives of happiness not as a momentary a feeling, not something that puts a smile on your face, the way that we tend to talk about happiness today and the way we've tended to talk about it since the 18th century. He conceives of happiness as a characterization of a life, a characterization of a life well lived. And this is in fact part of Aristotle's famous definition of happiness, that happiness is not momentary, it's not a subjective state, it's a description of an optimal life. And that's what all these Greek sages are really after, right? How to put together a human life in the best possible way. And I think that aspect of happiness is somewhat underplayed today. We think of happiness as, have a Coke and a smile and a laugh and good feeling, and less as a characterization of an entire life.
Yeah, so one of the things that as I'm working on my book, I try to take some of these ancient ideas and then link them through a bridge to the current empirical sciences, right, where we test some of these ideas. And what amazed me, I'd always loved and revered the ancient Greeks, but what amazed me, and here it reminds me of a story that Nassim Taleb, I don't know if you know him, the Lebanese author, who's a good friend of mine. Yeah. He once joked with me, teased me, and said, I don't know what you study in psychology. Everything that needs to be known about psychology, the ancient Greeks have already covered it. Now, I thought he was being a bit playful, but now that I read the ancient Greeks, I think he was onto something, because, for example, you look at the Stoics, the way they argue, well, look, if don't worry about something that you can't control. It's really how you respond to an event that really is within your control. Well, that already has very direct links to cognitive behavior therapy, which is one of the foundational, therapeutic interventions that we see in clinical practice. The Aristotle mean, I have a whole chapter in my forthcoming book where I talk about seeking the sweet spot, right? Well, the sweet spot is the mean of Aristotle. And I demonstrate in the book that so many phenomena, whether they be at the neuronal level, at the individual level, or at the aggregate societal level, follow an inverted U shape. The inverted U shape meaning that which is in the middle is optimal. Too little is not good, too much is not good, and the middle is right. And I actually argue that it is probably the most fundamental universal law that you see most often in nature, to see that inverted U. And so although they didn't have the weaponry of the empirical sciences, they were operating within the realm of philosophizing. They were exactly right. So the next question, I understand that you're not a classicist, but what is it in the water that they were drinking that allowed those particular folks to be so astoundingly wise across several centuries at the very least?
Yeah, I'm glad you make this point. It's one that I frequently make as well, and I joke with my psychologist friends that they're just figuring out what's already been known, and of course there's more to it than that. But my friend John Haidt, the psychologist, his early book, the subtitle is Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom, and John does precisely this, right? Looks at the ancient wisdom traditions through the lens of contemporary social science and psychological science, and says, hey, here's where there's a really, really interesting correspondence. So, well, what's in the water with the Greeks? I mean, I guess I would even broaden that. And, I used this term before, the axial age, which is as I say, this description of this really incredible movement in human history in the first millennia, when so many of our moral foundations are laid, our moral axes are laid in Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism, later in Christianity, Islam growing out of Judaism. And all those traditions are wrestling, I think, with what it means to live a good life and what are the conditions for bringing that about. And in doing so over the course of hundreds and eventually 1,000 years, they hit upon all kinds of truths. And so your point about the Greeks, I would just extend. I mean, really, really amazing things are happening at China in at exactly the same time. And the Confucian tradition and Taoist traditions are rich, rich, rich in terms of thinking about the psychology of human well-being.
Beautiful. So I guess the next question is to look at the history of your historical trajectory, right? So it's kind of a form of meta-history, which is the following question. I mean, you studied history of emotions, history of genius. I think you're working on a book on history of equality/inequality, history of happiness, history of ideas. How do you decide which concept or event or period you're going to spend your next 2, 3, 5 years working on? How does that process work?
Unfortunately, 6, 7, or 8. But
yeah, okay, fine.
Yeah. Well, so I was trained as a historian of the 18th century. That's where I cut my teeth. And my first book, Enemies of the Enlightenment, was about opposition to the Enlightenment and the origins of conservative thought. And really, all of my projects so far have singled out key notions that come to the fore in the 18th century and that have long afterlives, and of course had backstories as well. So happiness is really, as I intimated a little bit earlier, an idea that comes to public consciousness in a major way and gets actually politicized for the first time in the 18th century. The great French revolutionary Saint-Just, during the Jacobin radical phase of the French Revolution, stands up in the French National Convention and says happiness is a new idea in Europe. And that's an exaggeration to some extent, because as we've just been saying, of course, happiness has old roots in Greece and elsewhere. But to the extent that it gets politicized and publicized in the 18th century, Saint-Just had a point. So happiness is a key 18th century idea. Genius, as it turns out, the subject of my last book, Divine Fury, A History of Genius, is also an idea that comes to the fore in in the 18th century, and the genius as a kind of new cultural hero is really invented in the 18th century. And the same is true with the subject of my current book on equality. Equality is an idea that, although it has deep roots, religious and otherwise, and of course is very much an idea on the radar today, is one nonetheless that comes to the fore in the 18th century. And so I guess I'm a, as the French would say, a 18e by training and kind of preoccupation orientation, but I'm interested in concepts that that continue to have an afterlife, that matter to us today. And so tracing those genealogies of ideas that come to the fore and then continue to play out and preoccupy us to the present are very much in my interest.
I mean, I'm thinking of the motto of the French Republic, isn't it? Fraternité, égalité, and laïcité, right? So
Liberté.
Liberté, sorry.
Liberty and equality, sure, absolutely.
So that's where the equality could potentially be coming from, right? I mean, in terms of you tackling it in your next book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually like these other books. I'm beginning way back, and in fact, even before the ancient world, I have a whole chapter on the way that people have thought about hunter-gatherer societies and ascribed a kind of equality to them. And then I talk about ideas of equality in the ancient religious traditions and then ancient Greece as well. Their rhetoric and discussions of equality. But again, the 18th century is this kind of crucial turning point. And so, yeah, that French preoccupation with equality that you have at the time of the French Revolution grows out of a whole century of discussion around it in the 18th century.
A few days ago, you may or may not be aware of this, the great, now late Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson passed away. And
sure.
And you'll see in a second why I'm mentioning him, because I'm going to link it to our conversation of equality. So when he was famously asked to comment about communism/socialism, he said, "Great idea, wrong species." And what he meant by that is he's an entomologist by training. He studies social ants. And of course, social ants, their societal organization is that everybody is equal other than the reproductive queen. But for humans, while it is a great idea that we be equal under the law, we're not equal in our potential. We're not equal in our drive. We're not equal in our height. So the idea of trying to impose a particular economic and political structure on humans when it doesn't fit their human nature is problematic. That's why communism and socialism has failed wherever it's been tried. Now, today we often conflate, either willfully or ignorantly, the concept of equality with equity, equity being the idea that equality of outcomes is what we should be seeking, whereas, of course, I think any truly classical liberal person would think that equality of opportunities is what we should always be striving for. Do you tackle these kinds of issues, equality versus equity, and so on and so forth?
I do. In fact, I just finished my chapter on the kind of Marxian tradition and thinking about equality in Marxian thought. And ironically, I mean, Marx is somewhat scathing about equality. He sees equality as a kind of bourgeois ideology and recognizes very clearly, as you say, that human potential, human ability are very different. And so in his kind of imagination of what a communist utopia would look like, there's no indication at all that you would actually have equality of resources. You'd have different resources for different people. Now, obviously, things don't turn out that way in practice, and many of Marx's readers kind of overlook the fine points and the fine discussion of equality in his thought. But sure, absolutely. I mean, these kind of major differences between classical liberal and Marxian or socialist discussions of happiness are part and parcel of the discussion.
So coming back to happiness, I'll ask maybe one or two more questions, then we'll go to a whole bunch of other topics. So one of the things that interests me, as someone who studies consumer behavior, and certainly as an evolutionist, are things that are culturally culture specific versus human universal. So for example, in advertising, you talk about local advertising versus global advertising. Global advertising would be Coca-Cola decides from their headquarters in Atlanta to develop one advertising campaign, which they then transport to all cultures because there's some universal theme that everybody will understand. Local advertising would be you have to tweak it to the cultural contingencies of each society. And so now I'm going to use that framework to talk about happiness. So are there cross-culture, across all the traditions that you've covered in your historical treatise of happiness, what are the elements of happiness that you can point to that are truly culturally specific, that don't manifest themselves in the same way in other cultures, versus things that are absolutely universal? And then the second part of this question, same question, but using a temporal metric. What are things that are temporally invariant? Irrespective of the era, people have thought about this metric as the same regarding happiness versus things that are era constrained. Can you answer both those questions?
Sure, I can try. I mean, if we do the global brand first,
Sure.
pleasure is the global brand, and Coca-Cola understands that very well, right? Coke and a smile, right? Have an ice cold Coke, and that'll bring you happiness. And this is clearly a kind of universal human characteristic. We are wired, we're created as human animals to desire pleasure and to flee pain, and that's wired into our makeup. And all human beings everywhere seek pleasure, and they always have. What is also interesting, though, is that at the time, again, of the axial revolutions, one of the constant uniting very different religious and philosophical traditions is the rejection of that idea, or at least the rejection of the idea that pleasure and pleasure alone can bring us happiness. And of course, all these traditions are onto something profound. You know, as a student of evolution, that our desire to pursue pleasure is built into us, but we never get enough pleasure. Or when we get enough, we get bored and then we want something more. I like to point out that the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, this word pursuit is one that we focus on less than the word happiness. And in 18th century English, to pursue meant to follow in hostility, right? So you think of kind of pursuing something with a, like you hunt it. In fact, the French say la chasse au bonheur, the hunt for happiness. And if you think about that for a little bit, when you're hunting or stalking happiness, and what do you do when you actually get it? Well, you have to, shoot it or kill it or put it down. There's a kind of frenetic side to our desire for pleasure, right? And how that wears off. The psychologists, as you know, call this the hedonic treadmill, right? A little boom, you come back. So I think one of the things that all these religious traditions locked into is that, constantly pursuing pleasure leaves us dissatisfied, right? Or leaves us feeling a little bit empty. And so all of the axial traditions then imagine a kind of higher happiness or contentment, sometimes they put it, that would go beyond mere pleasure-pain calculus. So how to obtain pleasure beyond, obtain happiness beyond pleasure, beyond honor and gratification. And there, I think you can see some really interesting constants, as well as clearly all kinds of distinctions. I like to point out that all the religious traditions value human friendship and love, and we know, as social psychologists tell us, that that human beings are social creatures, that our friendships and our relationships to family and loved ones are crucial and correlate very highly with subjective well-being or happiness. So, to put a kind of moral valence on friendship, as Aristotle does, for example, in the Nicomachean Ethics, and relate it to happiness is crucial. And I think many of the religious traditions put their finger on this. Cultivating hope, seeing the world through hopeful lenses, matters a great deal, and we know that that optimistic people tend to be happy people or happier people, and so religions bid us to do that. See the good, even despite the evil, despite the suffering. Being thankful or grateful for what we have. Almost every religious tradition, begins with a prayer of thanksgiving. Thank God for the bounty that we have. Thank God for family. Thank God for this opportunity to be on this world. Give thanks and thanksgiving. That's again almost a universal in all these religious traditions and philosophical traditions. And we know that actually, expressing gratitude, writing gratitude letters, telling the people that that do kind things for us that we care and recognize, that also correlates with happiness. So I think this is another one of these kind of universals that's singled out. Giving to others, right, redounds to you. There's a Chinese proverb to the effect that if you want to maximize your happiness, give to others, right? And we also know that philanthropy and happiness have interesting ties, and so I think the religious traditions sort of focus in on this. Now, the way that gets expressed in particular cultures and particular moments at particular times varies tremendously, right. And so then you get this is when the micro branders come in, right, and do their work. But I think that so many of the traditions, and this is one of the things I think positive psychologists today have discovered, do span cultures and span time. There are universals in terms of what we as human beings need and desire and want.
Well, when you started your answer to my last question, you referred to sort of bonding, social bonding, and friendship. The psychiatrist Georges Vaillant, who used to lead the Harvard study of adult development. I guess you're familiar with him. Do you know who that is? Yeah,
I am. Yeah, I've met him. It's a while now.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. I think, I'm paraphrasing what he said. This is not a direct quote, but based on his years as the director of this sort of, I think it's now up to about 80 years that it's been going, this study, sort of tracking people's, as they go through all the life stages of their adult development. And he said, the one lesson that you need to take away from all of our studies is that, relationships matter. And that's, and then others have tried to quantify that in terms of, not having relationships is equivalent to smoking, 3 packs of cigarettes a day, right? Have you seen some of those studies?
I have.
And it is exactly speaking to what you're saying. And I notice it, I guess, on a personal level now that we're, at least, well, maybe we're a bit more draconian in Quebec than you guys in the US in terms of all the lockdowns and the curfews. That when I go on a walk with one of my good friends, for example, I'm one of my good friends is a professor of psychology at my university. He's a clinical psychologist, and we always do walk and talk sessions where we go for 90-minute walks, and we could be talking about Wittgenstein, and then we could be talking about radiologists who do MRI studies of paintings, and we were going all over the place. And then I come home and I'm invigorated in a way that is very different than I would be if I were sitting in solitude reading a great book, which is also pleasurable and intoxicating. But the mere fact of sharing these ideas with another person that you care about is truly one of the great pleasures of life. So I'm totally with you.
It is, and it turns out that the physical proximity matters too. It's wonderful to chat with you like this remotely via Zoom, and we've done a lot of that during the pandemic. And that's better than sitting in silence in one's office. But it doesn't seem to have the same benefits that one gets from actual physical proximity to friends and so forth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You are co-editor, so I'm going to hit you with a question on a completely different topic. Well, I guess it's kind of related. You're co-editor of a series with University of Chicago Press. I think the Life of Ideas. Did I get that right?
Correct. Yeah.
What would be, if I could put you on the spot, the singular greatest idea ever devised? I think you could probably guess what my answer would be, but let's hear what yours would be.
Boy, I'm never good at these kind of things. People ask me what's the best album.
First one that you could think of, or.
Well, first of all, I would kind of want to parse the question, what is an idea? And that gets complicated, but I think love is a pretty good idea. And it resonates in every culture. So I'm going to go with love.
You got to go with love. That. All right. Can you guess what I would say? Because I'm leaving it to the intellectual realm.
Oh, okay.
Evolution?
Sorry?
The theory of evolution?
Okay.
That would be my...
So you meant as a concept, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, you were broadening it.
I see. Yeah. Well, that's a pretty darn good one. No question.
I think that, this is an idea that explains all biodiversity on life, whether it be flora or fauna. And of course, in evolutionary psychology, it explains the most important organ that defines our personhood. It's called the human mind. And yet, you could explain the mechanism of evolution in grade 9 biology, so that you could
Yeah.
explain something so elegantly, succinctly, and simply, and that yet that could explain life, to me
Yeah.
seems like it could be certainly a good contender for the greatest idea ever devised.
I had the opportunity to go to the Galapagos a number of years ago, and as part of the trip, I gave a series of lectures on Darwin. And I'm not a specialist on Darwin, although I work on 19th century intellectual history. And it was just such an incredible pleasure to steep myself in his thought for a couple of months as I prepared these lectures. And yeah,
Well,
as you'd say, a leading contender for the great idea.
speaking about sociality and bonding, so just about 2 weeks ago, one of my former undergraduate students, who has since left sort of the business world and pursued his passion as an artist, sent me two two paintings of Darwin, which I have very proudly displayed on my social media. I mean, they're museum quality, and the sense of pride that I felt that I could have had such a positive influence on this student, that he would then be willing 10, 12, 14 years later, I can't remember when, be doing this for me. It's not like he charged me. It was, of course, they were gifts. That speaks again to this human bonding. It's such a beautiful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
All right, let's go on with some other stuff. Genius. Now, here is so much stuff that I could talk about. Number one, as soon as I read your bio and I saw genius, the first name that came to mind was Dean Simonton. And okay, so I guess you do know who that is.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are people that I've worked with and done. Dean and I have done events together and so forth.
Oh,
Yeah.
now, well, that's interesting that you say you've worked together, because Dean might arguably be the person who is the most productive scholar who's published the most single authored things. Am I right?
Yeah.
Now,
Well, I don't know the exact metrics, but he's hugely productive. And yeah, when I say work together, I mean we've been on panels and done talks and the like. We've never actually collaborated on scholarship. And as you say, he doesn't need any help.
but I'm very interested. I mean, I don't know if you have any insights about this before we drill down into the actual study of geniuses. I wonder why that would be. So, for example, I could speak to myself, and I might even mention this in my next book. So, one of the traits that I have, which can be both construed as a good thing or a bad thing, so maybe it kind of speaks to the Aristotle, golden mean issue. I'm very punctilious, very perfectionist, very morally scrupulous, maybe pathologically so that it takes a lot for me to trust someone else, so that if someone else is going to have their name on something that my name is on, then I'm worried, were they as careful? Did they scam any of the data? Were they as honest? And so I know that I would have been, however productive I've been in my life, I would have been a lot more productive had I been more open to, collaborating with people. And so I wonder if you have any insight as to if that could be driving what, because I mean, unless he is someone who is a misanthrope and he hates every human being, why would it be that he would have never found any solace, or not solace, any opportunities in collaborating with others?
Honestly, I know Dean well enough to know that he's certainly not a misanthrope. He's a really jolly, enthusiastic,
Right.
open-minded person. And I don't have a direct answer to that question. I mean, the question of collaboration in intellectual creative enterprises is really interesting. And,
Yeah.
there's a literature on the kind of genius of groups and that special thing that happens when, McCartney and Lennon get in a room together and boom, magic happens, right? And that can happen in different types of creative endeavor, and arguably always does. Even we have a myth in some ways of the genius as lone creator and lone producer, and geniuses are always embedded in networks. I'm looking at your book there on evolutionary psychology and the business sciences behind you, with a picture of Darwin on the cover, and of course Darwin had a huge network of interlocutors, and then he had a kind of family apparatus that was providing his meals and looking after his basic needs, that allowed him then to do the work that he did, and this is always the case. So there's always a social component to creativity and intellectual labor. What it is that drives people like Dean or people who produce an awful lot as interesting question in its own right. Um, Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, who we tend to associate rightly with eugenics. He's the father of eugenics, and the kind of darker side to that. But Galton actually cut his teeth as a student of genius. His very
Yeah.
first published work is called Hereditary Genius, and this was just the question Galton asked. What is it that distinguishes or characterizes those special beings he called geniuses that occur 1 in 1 million or 1 in 10 million in a population pool? And one of the traits that he identified was the capacity for hard labor,
Yeah.
right? In other words, you needed a kind of threshold of intelligence, and you needed to aspire to things that mattered, but you also needed the capacity for hard labor, that ability to kind of just throw yourself into the fray again and again and again, and that clearly is a distinguishing
Well,
characteristic.
maybe it's this word. Sorry to interrupt you. How about this word? Grit, right here.
Well, exactly. Another one of my friends. There's Angela. I mean, she actually. There's a long footnote that deals with me in that book. Funnily enough, we know each other for many years, and I told her a story about how growing up in California in the 1970s, I didn't meet the threshold to be in a mentally gifted mind program that the California Public Schools was administering, and that so pissed me off that I think I've spent most of my life trying to show those people they didn't know what they were talking about.
I think you've done a good job showing them.
Well, she talks about that story as a, kind of, and I don't know if I have grit, but I certainly have the capacity for hard labor, and I think that is an important thing.
Well, I mean, I'm often asked, what are your tips, professor, for being a successful writer, and of course you have to have a talent to synthesize material, to tell good stories, to be a good raconteur, to write well. But you also have to have the discipline of every day, whether you're feeling down or not, whether you're feeling up for it or not, to write a certain number of words. Otherwise, that book, that 70,000, 80,000, 90,000 words are not going to write themselves. And so it really, truly requires this incredible discipline to say, no matter what, every day I've got to hit my 300 words or 400 words per day marker, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, I liken writing to long distance running. It's like running a marathon, and half the time your feet hurt and, you're gasping for breath, but you just keep plodding on and eventually you get there.
But in your case, I mean, and I don't know if it's in all history, and I guess we'll talk about some of the field of history in a second in more details. But in your case, I mean, your biggest works have been books, whereas in many disciplines, as you know, books are considered second-class citizens to the peer-reviewed journal, which for me, I mean, all those distinctions are so ridiculous. I mean, I'm in the business of creating knowledge and then disseminating knowledge, and I'll use any vehicle and any platform to do so, including having conversations with wonderful guests such as yourself. So these kinds of distinctions don't matter to me. But why is it that in history, it seems to be the case that, you don't have as much of the peer-reviewed, but more of the here are my 3 books for my 10-year dossier? Why does that work that way?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we do have an extensive network of journals that are peer reviewed and so forth. But you're right that the book or the monograph is the kind of crucial marker in our field, more so than articles, as in many of the social and natural sciences. And you could give a historical response to that.
Yeah, okay, go for it.
It hasn't been always the case that people wrote books, that academics wrote books. They began to do so only towards the end of the. Clearly people have written books for a long time, but as a kind of marker of academic productivity, the book or the monograph emerges at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And it may have seen its day. I mean, I kind of hate to say that as an author of books, but I sometimes feel a little bit like a purveyor of 8-track tapes might have felt in the late 70s or early 80s. It's not clear that this is the cutting edge technology of the future. And now, we have podcasts and all other ways, so many different ways of getting ideas across. And, not as many people read books as they once did. And it may be the case that the monograph as the kind of marker of academic excellence in the humanistic disciplines is going to be a thing of the past.
Doesn't that sadden you?
Sure, but it's I think of my own children. My son's 14, my daughter's 11. And these people are wired to the teeth, and they're taking in media in so many different forms. But I can't get them to read a magazine, let alone sit down and read a book. Now I force them to do so, but they don't do that as a matter of choice the way that I did when I was growing
Yeah.
up, and the way so many of us did. And I think that's they're not outliers. They're indicative of what's happening today.
I do. I mean, it does worry me a lot because I face the same struggles with my children who are a bit younger than yours. Because as you probably know, and I don't know if I don't know if there is a reference to this, but I've heard it enough times that I'd like to think that it's true, that the number one predictor of your children's success is the number of books that are in your parents' home. Have you heard that stat before?
I haven't heard that one. I've heard things like it, but well, we've got a lot of books here.
Well, exactly, and so do I. If you
I don't know if anyone's reading them, but
but what my point is that there is a unique set of skills that comes with immersion. I mean,
yeah,
sometimes I'm to speak of your book, Happiness. The last probably 2 weeks, that's what I've been reading late at night, and I'm stuck in Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and not very light reading at 1 a.m. when I'm having a hard time
no, it's
sleeping.
not. Sorry about that, but it probably helps you to get to sleep.
No, not at all. But I'm deep in. There is an ecstasy. There is an intellectual pleasure that comes uniquely from me doing that process. And I think that if we don't find a way to rekindle that reflex in our children, I don't think you can be truly profound as a thinker if you don't have the reflex to read. No.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I would even say, I don't know that democracies work when people don't read and have the capacity for following sustained lines of thought and development, more so than a newspaper article. I mean, something about the long form of a book that seems crucial to serious thinking, but yeah.
And from the
That's another subject.
I was going to say, from the perspective of the creator of that knowledge, I mean, us, look, when I write an academic paper, the content is different across papers, but the template is already told, right? There is an introduction, there is a literature review, there is hypotheses, there is methodology, there is statistical analyses, there is conclusion. So the narrative, or the template for the narrative, is told. What's beautiful about writing a book, as you certainly know, yes, I start with a rough outline of what I'm going to say, which is part of the book prospectus that I sent to the publisher. But then there really is kind of this magic of an organic process whereby, I didn't know that I was going to encounter Happiness, A History by Darrin McKinnon. That really came from that organic process. So there is truly something uniquely lovely about writing the long form that you can't get writing scientific papers.
Right, and what you say is true of writing in general. I mean, often telling my students and graduate students that there's this conception out there, I think, that you go out and you do your research and then you develop your thoughts and then you pour them onto the paper. But what people who think that way don't realize is that actually the thinking happens as you're writing. And so, as you say, you begin with a broad outline, but it's only when you try to put those general thoughts down on paper and organize them lucidly and logically that you do the hard work that's necessary to think, and in doing that hard work you often create. So thinking is a product of writing, not just the consequence of it.
Beautiful. Okay, a few more questions now about history as a discipline and how we could link it to the scientific method, to evolutionary theory, and then I think I've taken enough of your time. Are we okay for another 5-6 minutes?
No, absolutely, absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, so earlier you mentioned humanities as you were answering the question about the monograph being what is typically accepted in the humanities, and of course,
exchange, yeah.
History, of course, is typically classified as a field within the humanities. But as I always tell people that are willing to listen, the scientific method is not something that is reserved for physicists or chemists, right? A sociologist can be just as serious a scientist as a physicist. The reason why sociology might not be perceived as being as prestigious as physics, in my view, is because it doesn't have the consilience of physics. In physics, you have a set of organized ideas that we can all agree on, and then therefore we can build a core of knowledge. We can disagree at the limits of that knowledge, but there are no chemists that are for the periodic table and chemists who are against the periodic table. Whereas in the social sciences, and certainly in the humanities, we can disagree about pretty much everything, right? So you could have, anti-science frameworks like postmodernism. You can have people who don't think that biology matters to humanity, to human behavior, whereas others like myself would say, how could you study human behavior without biology? So all this having said, I don't think that history need only be encapsulated within the humanities. I think you can be a historian who follows assiduously the scientific method. Do we agree on that at least?
Oh, completely. And I would just point out that in many colleges and universities, my own included, history doesn't fall under the rubric of humanities. It's in the social sciences.
Okay.
Now, I think of myself more as a humanist than a social scientist, but history has traditionally been thought of as a social science, and there are types of historians that lean more towards the social sciences and humanities, and those that lean more towards the humanities than the.
Although this is, I guess, a question that could be tested empirically. Although if you asked the lay person their view on this, they would think of history, right? I'm going to write a book about World War II, and I'm going to pontificate about a whole bunch of stuff that's rooted in some archival reality or whatever, but I'm not applying the scientific method. There isn't H1, H2, H3, and here's the data of how I'm going, right? So why is it that there is a disconnect between our sort of exemplar view, our prototypical view of a historian, and what you're saying is clearly not that? Why is there that disconnect?
Well, I don't know. I mean, as you say, it'd be interesting to test that, right? Empirically, is this the view of history that people really have? I don't think they would have had that view in the 19th century. And when history, did very closely model itself on the sciences, and as you probably know, in Europe, in France or in Germany, history is thought of as a science, a Wissenschaft. And in German, there's this distinction between the natural sciences, Naturwissenschaften, and the human sciences. And we sometimes translate Wissenschaft as science, which is not a perfect translation. It really means a coherent body of knowledge. But there's this conception that history is a body of knowledge in the way that physics is a body of knowledge, in the way that biology is a body of knowledge. There have been times in the evolution of history as a discipline when it has looked to the sciences and the social sciences more kind of resolutely than perhaps it does today. So I think of the attempt in the early 20th century by the French historians around the Annales school to compile large data sets to get real clarity on things like population and mortality rates and so forth. And that kind of history can often look pretty scientific, and aspects of the scientific method are certainly incorporated. But other historians, I think, see their job precisely not to provide the kind of clarity and certainty that you alluded to with the reference to the periodic table, but to rather show the contingencies, the problems, the doubts, the gray area that form around even our apparently clearest notions. And it takes both kinds of people working in the world, right? Those who pose questions and problematize, and those who provide answers and clarity. And I think the general population likes the clarity. That's let's just read the executive summary and get the answer. And problematizing often takes more work and more effort and more time, and that's not something we have a lot of in the modern world.
Fair enough. Now let's link your background in history to mine in evolutionary psychology. Are there many historians who utilize the evolutionary lens for studying whichever phenomena at whichever level of analysis? And maybe before you answer that, I can give you the one example. I can think of a few examples, but the one that I like best to quote is one by Laura Betsick. Have you heard of her? Do you know who she is?
I don't actually know.
Laura Betsick is a Darwinian historian, and she did a study. Well, she looked at despotic rule historically via the evolutionary lens. Basically, the idea being that despots monopolize sexual access to women and so on. Right. She also did a content analysis of the Old Testament, showing that depending on your social status in the Old Testament, you're a prophet, you're a general, you're a king, you're a peasant, you're a slave, and so on. Then, depending on your social status, determine the number of women that were associated to being your wives or concubines. And not surprisingly, the higher your social status, the more women you have, which of course we know from evolutionary theory, the number one metric of success for a man on the mating market is to have high social status. And so here what you're doing is you're taking real archival historical data and using an evolutionary lens to test specific hypotheses. Do we have a lot of this stuff in history or not much?
So, that kind of work is done. It's not the kind of mainstream of the historical discipline, and I think many of my colleagues are skeptical of it. I tend to be more open-minded about it.
Why are they skeptical? Before you go on.
Well, I think there's a concern about being too deterministic,
too reductionist,
too universalist. I mean, I think there's a concern about universalizing in the historical profession, with good reason, because what historians do, they place things in context. They look at the particular aspects and associations and characters of events, people, of times, and show how those change in different places, in different circumstances, where social scientists are looking for continuities and universals that apply in all cases and all times. And historians come at it precisely the opposite way. So therefore, there's a slight reservation about those people looking for constants and universals. But I think when people are careful, you can do some really good work. I'm familiar with the work of Peter Turchin. I don't know.
Of course, I do. I know who he is. Yes.
Of Connecticut, and he's not a historian and doesn't even describe himself, but he's clearly interested in historical dynamics and applying cultural evolutionary theory to them. And I found his work, tremendously thought-provoking, and I think there's more room for that marriage between science and the humanities.
Beautiful. Last question: are there any projects that you'd like to use this platform to promote? This is your chance to do so, Darrin.
I'm not, I feel like I'm so fundamentally out of sync with the time, because I don't like the idea of self-promotion. I was on Twitter for a while, and I just can't bear to do it anymore, because it just seems like it's people bragging about themselves all the time. So I'm not gonna
Listen, I'm a professor of marketing. What you call bragging, I call marketing. So, but fair enough.
There you go. Well, as I say, I'm out of sync with the world and its times. But we're all shouting, just grateful to have the time and have a nice chat with you.
Likewise, guys. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider supporting the channel any way that you can. Darrin, it's such a pleasure to meet you. You're only 2.5 hours away. Hopefully, when the overlords allow us to travel, maybe we could meet and have a chat like this in person.
I would love that, and as I told you before, I love Montreal, so hopefully we'll connect there, or in Hanover or New York or some such.
Cheers! Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Cheers.